Thank you very much, Danielle. It's wonderful to be here today. Thank you also to the Governor General, David Johnson, to all the wonderful people at Canada History, including CEO Janet Walker, as well as to the Museum of History, for honoring so many Canadians with history awards. To the students, teachers, writers, scholars, and museum representatives who will be joining me at Rideau Hall tomorrow, congratulations to all. Je suis d'autant plus heureux de recevoir mon propre prix, sachant que je le reçois parmi vous, et que nous œuvrons ensemble en célébrant et en affirmant l'histoire canadienne dans une manière qui inclut nous tous et qui est à la fois intellectuellement pénétrante et remplie de bon cœur et de la générosité. Since this is a forum on women's history, I'm delighted to share the stage today with Janet Walker, Dr. Stacey Barker, Danielle Metcalfe-Chennai, Isabelle Metcalfe, Charlotte Gray, Rudy Heap, Jean Barman, Dominique Delandre, and Rose Fine-Myers, as well as, of course, Maude Couturier. Just as I've argued that Black history is not merely the province of Black people, but reflects Canadian history and affects Canadians in our totality, women's history is history, writ large. Les hommes ont également le devoir de faire attention à l'histoire des femmes, aux droits des femmes, et à leurs défis, souffrances et rencontres avec l'inégalité, ainsi que leurs succès. As a son, sibling, spouse, parent, citizen, and writer, I cannot achieve my potential as a contributing member of society without concerning myself with the lives and rights and futures of women. This is true of all men. Comme les autres noteront et ont déjà noté, aujourd'hui nous sommes à la portée de célébrer le centenaire du vote des femmes au Canada. In 1918, as you know, some Canadian women got the right to vote in federal elections. Women received the right to vote in provincial elections in 1916 in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. BC and Ontario followed the next year. It wasn't until 1940 that women obtained the right to vote in Quebec. But really, in discussing these key moments in the history of the Canadian franchise, we're not talking about all women. Chinese Canadian women and men could not vote in federal elections until 1947, and Japanese Canadian women and men did not receive this right until the following year. And as we've noted already, Aboriginal women and men could not vote in federal elections until 1960. Considering how long it took for women and for male and female racial minorities to gain the right to vote in Canada, we do well not merely to assess Canadian history, but also to examine and forever be on guard with regard to the societal and democratic rights of women today. I join the great many Canadians who insist on a full inquiry into murdered and missing Aboriginal women in Canada. In addition, I hope and have to believe that I join the majority of peaceful, respectful, and democratically minded Canadians who do not wish to see hatred fomented or wedges inserted between Canadians by any political actors who deem to control what a woman freely chooses to wear in a citizenship ceremony. Or when she's visiting Parliament, or when she's working in any public office. Over the centuries, it seems that women and racial minorities have taken turns being denied the rights of other citizens. As just one horrific example, a reminder of a time when Canadian authorities have committed moral atrocities. In 1734, an enslaved woman by the name of Marie-Joseph Angelique was dragged to the streets of Montreal and publicly executed. After having been brutally tortured, the bones in her legs were crushed and forced to confess under torture to having burned down the house of her slave owner. We had to wait until 1834 before slavery was abolished in Canada and most of the rest of the British Empire. Governments in Canada have not apologized for legitimizing and enabling the practice of slavery in these lands before Confederation. However, our federal governments have had the great good sense, vision, and courage to apologize for interning Japanese Canadians and stripping them of their lands during World War II, and for instituting the discriminatory Chinese head tax, and for perpetuating cultural genocide in the form of residential schools for Aboriginal children. We should remember our mistakes so as not to repeat them. Today is not a good time, and there is never a good time to demonize or discriminate against Muslim women. If we can join together in asserting and demanding that political leaders respect the political and social rights of Muslim women and of Aboriginal women, then hopefully historians in 50 years will not be judging us for making a series of monumental missteps or steps backwards in our ever tenuous march toward a full and inclusive society for all women, men, and children in Canada. I'd like to turn now to describing my own passion for history and for mining and popularizing it as a novelist. I've long been interested in drawing women as characters in fiction. Women played vibrant, colorful supporting roles in my first and second novels, and one of them, Millicent Kane, came close to waging a coup and assuming center stage in my second novel, In Your Own Blood. But by the time I began to write my third novel and seventh book, The Book of Negroes, I felt ready to give myself over to the voice of a woman. I'm referring to the 18th century woman Aminata Diallo, my character, who's raised in freedom and dignity by a mother who's a midwife and a father who's a jeweler in rural West Africa, until she's stolen from her village, sold into slavery, and spends the rest of her life trying to get free and then to find her way back home. The Book of Negroes is a fictional slave narrative. Although it's a novel, a work of my imagination, it emerges from the traditional slave narrative. The autobiography of the ex-slave is the first form of literature produced and widely disseminated by black writers in the Americas, and some of them were women. Harriet Jacobs and Mary Prince are among the better-known women to have written slave narratives. All slave narratives begin on the same note. This is my name. Here is when and where I was born. Here is how I came to lose and regain my freedom. And listen up, dear reader, because I'm going to put down here in chronological order my life to bear witness to injustice and to prove my equality to you. As I began to write the Book of Negroes, I thought of all the women who'd written slave narratives and of all the people, women and men, black and white, European and African, who'd come into contact in some way with the Atlantic slave trade and who'd written first-person accounts of witnessing, surviving, or taking part in it. It was an incredible history, largely unknown in Canada and the United States. I first learned of it, the history of the Black Loyalists, 15 or so years before I began to write the story, when I read the fabulous scholarly work called The Black Loyalists by the University of Waterloo historian James Walker. In it, I learned about three essential migrations involving black women and men and their journeys toward, through, and out of the land we now call Canada. The first, of course, was during the American Revolutionary War, when British military commanders promised freedom to any women and men who'd been enslaved, who'd cross over and fight for or serve the British during the American Revolutionary War. Thousands of men and women with their children in tow did so, coming to New York City to serve the British behind military lines as cooks, soldiers, spies, midwives, prostitutes, you name it, they did it to prove their utility to British forces. The second essential migration had to do with the creation of the document known as the Book of Negroes, created by the British Navy to record the exodus of 3,000 women, men, and children, all black, leaving New York City at the end of the Revolutionary War and coming mostly to Nova Scotia, the first massive wave of black people in a short window of time into Canada. That was 1783. The third key migration of women and men and children being in 1792, about a decade after they arrived in Nova Scotia, when 1,500 black women, men, and children chose voluntarily to leave Nova Scotia to sail back across the Atlantic Ocean and to create the colony of Freetown in Sierra Leone in West Africa. As I contemplated the Black Loyalists and their journeys back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean in the 18th century, I began to imagine a woman's life and a woman's story. I envisaged a woman standing on the deck of a ship, about to leave the Halifax Harbor in 1792. Where did she come from? Where were her parents? Did she have a lover? Children? What skills did she have? How had she survived slavery and negotiated freedom? What did she look like? How did she walk? What did her voice sound like? Why was she standing on the deck of one of the 15 ships carrying 1,200 black women, men, and children across the Atlantic Ocean to Africa? What strength and purpose of mind must it have taken for her and for others to choose to abandon Nova Scotia, the British colony that had beckoned as Canaan, but so sadly disappointed them as a land of slavery, racial segregation, landlessness, especially for blacks, poverty, and an anti-black race riot? Like real people, in real time, the fictional Aminata Diallo crosses the Atlantic Ocean freely and voluntarily as an adult, passing slave vessels as she sails to found the colony of Freetown in Sierra Leone on the west coast of Africa. She and her fellow adventurers became the first significant group of black people to leave the Americas and return to Africa. I use the word return advisedly because 1/3 of the women and men on board those 15 ships leaving Halifax had come from Africa. They had been stolen from their homelands, enslaved in the Americas, won back their freedom by serving the British on the losing side of the American Revolution, and finally, in 1792, they were leaving Halifax to cement their freedom and equality in Sierra Leone. James Walker and Ruth Holmes Whitehead are among two of the most significant writers about the history of the black loyalists. I stood on their shoulders as I began to envisage a novel and to explore and dramatize the subject. Given the plethora of history books and archival documents, why bother with fiction? Why art? If you desire hard facts, historical nuggets, and clear analysis, your best bet is to read the works of journalists and historians. But if you want to read about the beating of the human heart, or if you seek guidance in imagining a woman's life in the 18th century, born free, enslaved, free again later, and seeking always to educate herself, love her own people, and return to the homeland from which she was stolen, if this is what you need as a reader, then perhaps the novelist is your best friend. After spending 5 years steeped in history books, libraries, archives, the Book of Negroes historical ledger, and 18th century maps of Africa, it became my task to give a face to the faceless. The very process of describing a person as a slave tends to put a mask on her face. We don't see a girl with her parents, or a woman acting as a midwife, or a person with a lover, children, skills, literacy, a love of life and wisdom. Instead, we only imagine a faceless person in chains when we hear the word slave. My challenge in writing the Book of Negroes was to give a face, a personal history, a dramatic struggle to one character, a woman named Aminata Diallo, and to help the reader see more deeply into our own past and to admire the resilience of women who've gone before us. At the heart of my meditation was the question: how do you endure the worst imaginable insults to your humanity and still retain the will to love, to survive, to live well, to give to others, and to testify? It is in testifying, telling our own stories, constructing our own narratives, both imaginary and real, that we rediscover and assert our humanity. I'll now read a very brief excerpt from the Book of Negroes to finish off, told from the vantage point of Aminata Diallo, an old woman who is now just one step from the grave as she remembers her life story. In these opening pages of the Book of Negroes, we're in London. Aminata is old. The year is 1807, and Aminata is advocating for the abolition of the British slave trade. Mais je mets les lunettes d'abord. The other day, they took me into a London school and had me talk to the children. One girl asked if it was true that I was the famous Mina D, the one mentioned in all the newspapers. Her parents, she said, did not believe that I could have lived in so many places. I acknowledged that I was Mina D, but that she could call me Aminata Diallo if she wanted, which was my childhood name. We worked on my first name for a while. After 3 tries, she got it. Aminata. 4 syllables. It's really not that hard. Aminata, I told her. She said she wished I could meet her parents and her grandparents. I replied that it amazed me that she still had grandparents in her life. Love them good, I told her, and love them big. Love them every day. She asked why I was so black. I asked why she was so white. She said she was born that way. Same here, I replied. I can see that you must have been quite pretty, even though you are so very dark, she said. You would be prettier if London never got any sun, I replied. She asked what I ate. My grandfather says he bets you eat raw elephant. I told her I'd never actually taken a bite out of an elephant, but there had been times in my life when I was hungry enough to try. I chased 300 or 400 of them in my life, but never managed to get one to stop rampaging through villages and stand still long enough for me to take a good bite. She laughed and said she wanted to know what I really ate. I eat what you eat, I told her. Do you suppose I'm going to find an elephant walking about the streets of London? Sausages, eggs, mutton stew, bread, crocodiles, all those regular things. Crocodile, she said. I told her I was just checking to see if she was listening. She said she was an excellent listener and wanted me to please tell her a ghost story. Honey, I said, my life is a ghost story. Then tell it to me, she said. As I told her, I'm Aminata Diallo, daughter of Mamadou Diallo and Sira Koulibaly, born in the village of Bayo, 3 moons by foot from the Grain Coast in West Africa. I'm a Bamana and a Fula. I'm both. We'll explain that later. I suspect I was born in 1745 or close to it. Thank you so very much.